السلام عليكم ومساء الخير والجميع ونرحب بكم لهذا الندوة الخاصة. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special session at IISS Middle East, where we will be presenting our new, extremely new publication, hot off the presses, Missile Defense Cooperation, which is a dossier which has been in preparation, I think, for the last 9 months. At least 9 months, on an extremely important and topical subject, as we see every day. I have two of the principal authors with me on the panel to discuss this dossier and the wider issues associated with it. Mike Ellerman and Professor Toby Dodge. And the plan is, I think, that they're going to speak for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, present some of the main themes of the report, and then we'll throw the discussion open for questions and answers, which are generally the most lively and productive part of these events. Before I do so, I'm going to do what they do on those music streaming websites, which is to say, if you like this, then you're going to like that. Because the next session we are putting on here with the Japanese embassy is entitled, is on the 3rd of November, so in about a week's time, on new security dynamics in East Asia, Japan's expanding strategic portfolio, which is another extremely interesting and relevant subject. I was actually in Oman over the weekend with some of my colleagues at a South Asia forum, security forum that we run with India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so forth. We had Chinese representation, we had a Bangladeshi, Iranian representation as well. This wider issue of security posture in the age of the One Belt, One Road, I think is extremely important. So that's on the 3rd of November. So I'm going to remind you about it afterwards as well, so you don't forget. This particular subject that we're going to deal with this evening is, as I said, highly topical. It's a subject that's increasingly in the news. It's a subject that's increasingly the subject of commentary and analysis. We have seen recently, of course, the effects of missiles from whatever source in Yemen. And it's an issue that is particularly relevant, of course, in this year of an American presidential election. So in terms of actually how people think the new US administration is going to position itself in this region. Whoever the president may be and whatever she might choose to do. Thank you. You're welcome. And this report is a product of a pretty intense period of field work and research, detailed research. And it does 4 things. Firstly, as you might expect, it examines the threat posed to the security of principally of the GCC by Iran's medium and short-range ballistic missiles. Second, it looks how the 6 members of the GCC have sought to move towards a system of more collective security that would help address that threat more effectively. Third, the report looks in some detail at what a more strategically efficient and effective approach to missile defense in the GCC would look like. And I won't go into detail about this, but I think Mike will talk about this in more detail. I mean, clearly this is an issue that's been the subject of debate within the GCC for many years. I think it has become more acute as Iran has increased its missile stocks, and of course there is debate now about the possible enhancement and modernization of those stocks. And finally, fourthly, the dossier puts forward a set of concrete policy proposals, which is always the key thing. A set of suggestions that, if adopted, might allow the GCC to make speedier progress in its goal of collective missile defense. These focus, for example, on the gradual integration of missile defense systems, along with the need for more detailed political and diplomatic negotiations within the GCC to reach agreement at the highest level on when such integrated missile defense would be activated, in what circumstances it would be used, and what will it defend. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Mike to talk about some of those issues. As I said, he'll talk for about maybe 10 minutes, and then I'll ask Toby to talk about the broader regional context. Mike.
Thank you, JJ, and thank all of you for coming today. I want to start off by talking about the general threat posed by Iran's rather large stockpile of ballistic missiles. Now, overall, Iran's national defense and deterrence strategy is informed by the many conflicts that have occurred in the region since 1980. This would include the imposed war, or the Iran-Iraq war, from 1980 to 1988, the US-led coalition to dislodge Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and surprisingly, the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, where rockets were a main feature. And this served somewhat as a laboratory for some of Iran's ideas about how missiles might be used. In 2007, Iran's military strategists published and adopted the Mosaic Doctrine. This is a doctrine that recognizes that Iran faces superior conventional forces in the region, and that it has to adopt and employ tactics and strategies that can reduce the effectiveness of these superior forces. At its core, the Mosaic strategy calls on or rests on three pillars. The first is the use of proxy forces to punish any would-be aggressor or anyone supporting a would-be aggressor. Secondly, the use of swarming tactics in the Gulf itself to counter the superior naval forces held by not only the US, the UK, and the French navies operating in the area, but also the GCC navies. And thirdly, the use of ballistic missiles and the threat of missiles use to deter would-be aggressors, and in the case of some kind of military action against Iran, they would use the missiles to retaliate in kind. What is very interesting is the thrust of Iran's activities in terms of procurement of missiles from about mid-1990s up until the last 5 years has been to increase the range of its stockpile. And that is to be able to reach Israel, to a lesser extent parts of Turkey. But their main goal was to prevent an Israeli attack on their nuclear facilities. Now that they have that capability, they're beginning to restructure and re-examine how they want to move, or the direction they want to move their missile forces in the future. And we're seeing a concentration on improving the lethality of their missiles, and the accuracy and the actual destructiveness. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Presently, the Iranian arsenal consists of 200 to 300 Shahab 1 and 2 missiles. These are essentially the old Soviet Scud-B and Scud-C missiles. They have a range of 300 to 500 kilometers and carry a modest conventional payload of about 1 ton. In the case of the Scud-C or Shahab 2, it's 750 kilograms. Just to put that in context, the destructive force of a 1-ton warhead is actually quite limited. It's limited to about 50 meters in diameter, 70 meters if it's exposed personnel. The harder the target, the less the destruction radius. These missiles allow Iran to attack major parts or major cities in Iraq. That's what they were initially intended to be used for, but they can also reach the eastern shores of the Gulf, Arab Gulf states. But they can't reach deep into, say, Saudi Arabia. Now, Iran also possesses a growing number of battlefield weapons. These are actually missiles they have designed, developed, and produced by themselves. They're very self-sufficient. This includes the Fatah 110 and now the new Fatah 313. These missiles would actually be designated for use on the battlefield or near battlefield. The maximum reach of the Fatah 313 is 300 kilometers. That's not enough to stretch all the way from the shores of Iran to most of the capitals in the Gulf. Kuwait is threatened by them, and the eastern parts of the United Arab Emirates would also be threatened. But the distance from Manama to likely launch spots that can be protected is beyond 300 kilometers. So these missiles are clearly designed to attack any invading army or any army preparing to invade along Iran's borders. I don't see them as being designed to threaten any of the capitals here on this side of the Gulf. As I mentioned, Tehran has also been developing and has medium-range missiles. This consists of the Shahab 3 and what is known as the Ghadr missile. These are derived from the North Korean Nodong, which is actually derived from an old Soviet design that was never actually fielded by the Soviets. They have about 100 of the Shahab 3 Ghadr type missiles. These can fly anywhere between, depending on the payload size, but about 900 kilometers and up to 1,600 kilometers. This is enough to reach Israel, which was one of their prime goals during the late 90s and I said the early 2000s. They are also developing an indigenously designed and produced system called Sajil. It's a 2-stage solid propellant missile. They first began testing it in 2008, but they have not tested it since 2011. We don't know exactly why that is, but we do know that it's not fully developed yet, it's not reliable, and it is likely not fielded, though it could be used in emergency situations. There's no evidence to suggest that Iran is trying to develop a missile that can reach beyond 2,000 kilometers. That could change in the future, but there's no evidence of such now. Now, the important thing to understand about the missiles that Iran has developed is they're highly inaccurate. Typically, about half the missiles will land within 1,000 meters of its intended target. If you recall what I said earlier, the damage radius or lethal radius of these missiles is on the order of 50 to 70 meters. So the probability of actually destroying a specific target using the Shahab missiles, the Ghadr, is less than 1 in 1,000. Looked at differently, they would have to launch more than their entire stockpile in order to hit a specific target, like a command bunker, a radar, or something like that. They could, however, be used to incite terror by attacking cities. It's unlikely, in my view, and in talking to a number of other experts on Iranian defense doctrine, that they would actually seek to attack the capitals in this region. Primarily, Bahrain, for example, large Shia community. They wouldn't want to because of the inaccuracy, that inevitably a lot of their, I guess, religious cohorts would be killed collaterally. The same as in Dubai. You have a large number of Iranians, and it really doesn't serve much of a purpose with regard to what they would want to be achieving. However, they could attack airfields and disrupt operations at an airfield. They couldn't halt operations, but they could certainly disrupt them. Same with large staging areas or encampments where military personnel are housed or are preparing, and port facilities where war material is coming in and out, and just raise the risks of operating in those areas. But Iran has, since about 2010, has refocused and reprioritized its development efforts. What we see today is a concerted effort to improve the accuracy of their missiles. It's going to be a long road, but with the Fatah 110 and some of their shorter range systems, they're having some success in improving the accuracy. They recently, I think about a year ago this month, they unveiled something called the EMOD. It's basically the Shahab 3 or Ghadr with what they say is a maneuverable warhead that can make corrections and attack a specific target. That's something that'll take at least 10, if not more, years for them to perfect. So I don't see them having what I would call a militarily decisive ballistic missile force in the near future, but I think in the longer term that's what they will seek. Now, before turning it over to Toby to talk about the experiences with collective defense in the region, I want to talk about just 6 ways that Iran could, that the Gulf states could react or help mitigate the effects. And I won't talk in any detail about them, but one is diplomacy, arms control, confidence building measures. I don't see them as a fruitful course of action. They shouldn't be ignored, but it's highly unlikely that Iran would yield in any way with regard to their missiles. If you recall, they drew a red line, if you will, in the nuclear negotiations, and they continue to test ballistic missiles in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions. So I think the thought that we could negotiate them away it's highly improbable. There are supply side restrictions, that is increasing the sanctions and helping prevent the transfer of necessary technologies. When the UN Security Council or the UN sanctions were in place, actually the international community had quite a bit of success in intercepting materials, components, and systems that were destined for Iran. Now that those sanctions have been lifted as a result of the nuclear deal that was reached, there is a worry that more commodities will become available for Iran to import and then utilize in their weapon systems. Fortunately, there is something called the Missile Technology Control Regime, which it's a voluntary, membership group which promises to abide by certain standards. And that will prevent, if they're adhered to, will prevent the transfer of any substantial technologies, components that would enhance Iran's capacity to create more effective missiles. Unfortunately, North Korea is not a part of the Missile Technology Control Regime, so I think one of the things we need to be constantly vigilant about is the transfer of things from North Korea. Passive defenses. You can conceal potential targets, you can make them mobile, you can harden them. These, for certain types of potential targets, this is feasible. For industrial infrastructure, it's much more difficult given their size. Certainly can't make power plants, desalination plants mobile. And they're too large an area to really harden. Civil defense, however, is something that could be conceived and implemented here to reduce the number of casualties one would experience if cities are attacked. One can take, for example, during World War II, The Germans used both V-1, kind of the equivalent to, or the predecessor to cruise missiles, and the V-2, which was a ballistic missile. They both carry the same size warhead, but if you look at the death rates between the two, they were half the casualty rate for the cruise missiles as there was for the ballistic missiles. This is because the cruise missiles were very loud and could be heard about 30 to 60 seconds prior to impact. This allowed people to take shelter, and thus the casualty rates were reduced by half when compared to the ballistic missile attacks. I think the same would be experienced if early warning sirens and such were implemented in the Gulf region, and there were some civil defense capacity, but in general, if you come to the center of a building, you're going to be safe unless you take a direct hit. Preemptive strikes during a conflict, that is, kill the launchers or launch vehicles before they have a chance to actually launch the missile. This is a very challenging endeavor. If one recalls, in 1991 during the Desert Storm operations, the U.S. was highly unsuccessful at actually interdicting on things on the ground. Now, technologies have greatly improved in the last 25 years, but that is really offset by just the size of area Iran has to patrol its mobile launchers. Moreover, you have the geography favors Iran. You have lots of valleys and wadis and such, mountains, that the sensors would have to be directly overhead, and so would the shooters. So it's going to be a very difficult task. That's not to say it's not worthwhile to pursue it. While it can't halt missile fire, it can certainly stress the launch crews in Iran. It can also disrupt operations, make it much more difficult for them to use one of their favorite techniques, and that is to launch salvos of missiles in an attempt to overwhelm missile defenses. You can degrade capability over the course of time by attriting some of the launchers. So it's worth pursuing. And then there's what I call deterrence by punishment, and that's actually counterattacking with using your air forces. I don't think the Gulf states need ballistic missiles to be able to attack in kind. Rather, a much more versatile platform is the use of an air force with standoff munitions. But this requires the Gulf states and the U.S., Britain, France, to have an articulated strategy or doctrine that says, if you launch missiles against one of the Gulf Arab states, we will respond in an overwhelming fashion. It won't be worth your effort. But this must be credible, and the Gulf states and their allies will have to demonstrate the willingness or convey the willingness to use them, and they certainly have the capacity to do so with the air forces that are in place now. And finally, there's deterrence by denial. It's what I call the regular missile defense that you'll always hear about, and we'll talk about this in greater detail. But this is a defense that intercepts the missiles while they're the attacking missiles while they're in flight, using proven technologies. You have the Patriot systems that are already deployed in the region. You have the theater high altitude area defense. No, it's terminal high altitude area defense, or THAAD. And there are other measures, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. So, Toby.
Okay, thanks. Now, as Mike has laid out in a great deal of detail, the missiles are at the center of Iranians' asymmetrical mosaic defense. That clearly Iran is pursuing the development of greater missile capacity and greater accuracy, and that in a post-Iranian nuclear deal world, the sanctions and the scrutiny on Iran and the capacity to sell more weapons to Iran is going to decline with the capacity of selling more weapons to Iran increasing. So clearly there's an identifiable threat. The threat is probably going to get worse. And what the central puzzle, for me at least, of this dossier was to try and find an explanation about why collective missile defense in the GCC has been so comparatively limited. Why has the GCC invested much more in bilateral missile defense and in security guarantees from the United States? And so we've developed a thesis that would say that there are three broad periods of threat perception in the GCC, with the first period leading to greater military cooperation, the second period leading to a fall-off of that cooperation, and now we're into the third period, and we're speculating, and Mike will then examine what greater cooperation may lead to. So the first period is quite obviously heralded by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the massive expansion of Iranian foreign policy ambition in the wake of the revolution, but also the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by indigenous Islamic radicals. So what we have, I think, is almost a steep rise in threat perception across the GCC, which unsurprisingly leads in May 1981 to the formation of the GCC, to this collective economic but centrally security organization. Now, in that period, dare we say the golden period of GCC military collaboration, you see a fairly quick progress. The Higher Military Council formed within the GCC General Secretariat was formed within 18 months. You have substantial progress being made in that High Military Council around defining general objectives for GCC military programs, and then you have the high point of the agreement with the formation of the Peninsula Shield Force based in Saudi Arabia. And that's not to say that progress hasn't been made since. You could argue that in 2001, with the creation of the Belt of Cooperation, this distributed command and control network that links the air operation centers across the GCC states, providing for aircraft identification and tracking capabilities, there has been some progress forward. But I think when you look at the varying speed of defense collaboration, it's clear something rather major happened in 1990 with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. When faced with a direct military threat to the continued survival of the GCC states, or at least the smaller ones, the GCC states looked at the potential for collective security, but then clearly looked at the immediate defense potential of bilateral deals with the United States. And post-1991 sees a rapid increase in US commitment to the individual security of the GCC states. And I think you can undoubtedly see a shift from an investment and a hope and some progress to collective security to the individual bilateral deals that the GCC states struck with the United States. And I think you could argue to some degree we're still in that second period. That when you look at the attempts of the GCC states individually to build defenses against the missile threat from Iran that Mike's outlined, they're still very much bilateral, with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia buying Patriot PAC-2 missiles in the aftermath of Operation Desert Storm in 2001, then beginning 2008, and then on to 2011, you see major United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar investment in bilateral weapons defense systems. But what we're investigating here, and I think what's intriguing, is have we now entered a third stage of threat perception that could lead to a renewed move towards collective defense in the GCC? And of course, this would be moving on from the invasion and regime change in Iraq in 2003, with the collapse of the eastern flank of the Arab world, if you want, with Saddam Hussein being removed, and a government more aligned with Iran taking power. Then you have the blowback from that, the rise of radicalization across the region, and then after 2011, the rise of the Arab Spring with the internal problems that gave birth to, mainly not in the Gulf, but in the Gulf as well. Now, to compound all that, to accelerate this sense of threat perception and vulnerability, the Obama administration made it very clear that it wanted to disentangle itself from two very long and costly wars engaged by the Bush administration, its predecessor, and made quite a lot, possibly in retrospect far too much, of its so-called pivot to Asia. Now, both the invasion of Iraq, the realignment of Iraqi foreign policy, the radicalization that gave birth to, and then the United States, at least verbal commitment to pivot to Asia, I think has given a new threat perception. And all of these, I think, were personified in the instability in Yemen. Now, we could get into quite a lot of really interesting detail, the extent to which, initially at least, Iran was a major player in that instability. But clearly, as we know, Operation Decisive Storm was triggered, and this would be the most, I think, the most ambitious, the most long-running collective military action that states of the GCC have engaged in pushing forward to that. Now, the thing that we're wrestling with in the dossier is, does this signal the dawning of a new age of GCC collective defense, of military cooperation in the face of definable threats, of a rising threat perception comparable to the aftermath of 1979? So I'll leave those thoughts with you to be picked up in questions, and I'll turn back to Mike to say, what would this collective missile defense look like if it were pursued by the GCC states collectively?
Thank you, Toby. Before actually getting into why collective defense is superior, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the requirements for missile defense. Now, it's important to keep in mind that missile defense is a lot like air defense. It does not create an impenetrable shield through which no attacking missiles can actually reach their targets. Rather, what it does is it seeks to limit the damage an enemy can inflict upon you using missiles or aircraft. As such, it becomes necessary to actually define what you want missile defense to do. And there are three steps to the process. One is you have to decide, what are you trying to defend? Are you looking to defend major cities? Population centers? Or are you looking to try to protect critical infrastructure such as desalination plants, power plants, refineries? Or are you trying to preserve military capabilities, airfields to keep them operating at full rate capacity, port facilities that are so critical to the import of material and personnel, and other items that may not be in the country, troop encampments, fuel depots, and et cetera. And then once you've created a list, what they call a defended asset list, those things that must be defended or protected, you have to determine what level of protection is required. How many missile strikes on a target type, whether it be a city, an airfield, or a military encampment? How many missile strikes are acceptable? Of course, we want it to be zero, but that is not practically feasible. So we have to determine, what level of strike could you accommodate, if you will, or what type of defense, given the number of missiles that might be used in an attack, do you need to I guess, reduce the risks and damage to an acceptable level? Now, for a large city, blocking 10 attacking missiles, or 20 or 50, if you can block completely attacks of that size 50% of the time, is that acceptable? I don't know. This is what we have decision makers, that have to wrestle with this problem. An airfield, for example, in the middle of a war, you may need a higher level of protection. You may need to protect against an attack size of 10, 20, 50 missiles or warheads with a probability of 0.75 or 0.9, meaning that 90% of the time you block all of the missiles that are coming at you. A nuclear power plant, the requirement might be even larger given the potential damage that could be done if you were to breach the reactor core. And then finally, you have to determine, well, how much can I afford to spend on all this? So those three measures are something that decision makers within the Gulf need to wrestle with in trying to sort out how much defense and what types of defense they'll need. Now, what we've done in the dossier is we tried to examine, in addressing these questions, measures of missile defense effectiveness that could help us understand the value, or maybe the limited value of cooperation, or sharing or building a collective defense. There were three measures that were, I guess, determined and used. One is the size of the defended territory. How much area can you defend using a given missile defense type, whether it be Patriot, THAAD, or an Aegis system? Second, we looked at interceptor efficiency. How many of the attacking missiles can you handle using these types of systems, given the performance envelopes that are expected for the missile defenses? And finally, what would the size of those defenses be? So in other words, these measures are trying to address the three questions that policymakers or decision makers have to wrestle with when trying to determine what an architecture should look like. What we found in general, I guess I'm burying the lead here, is that the higher the level of cooperation, the more effective your defense is using the three measures that I just mentioned. Now, in examining this, what we did was we came up with a notional architecture that could be applied to the Gulf. Now, how do we do that, since we don't know what the defended asset lists are for different countries, and they'll probably vary from country to country? We had to undertake some assumptions, so there are a number of caveats that go with what we've done. But nonetheless, because we wanted to examine things on a comparative basis, I think that the assumptions, as long as we're consistent, don't make that much of a difference in the overall assessment. For what I was able to do is establish that it probably require about 55 Patriot batteries distributed across the GCC states to provide the level of protection we think that leaders would want, or to the types of targets they'd want to protect. Now, how did I derive this? I used Google Earth to see where existing Patriot and other air defense assets were located. And I also looked at where were missile defense systems deployed in 2003 in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, when a large number of Patriot systems operated by the US were flooded into the region. So using those two, I guess, data points, I was able to determine that about 55, it could be 60, it could be 50, but roughly 55 Patriot systems would be needed. Alternatively, you could look at larger area defense capabilities, that is the THAAD system. Here we posited 4 THAAD systems could do a relatively good job if they're positioned properly across the Gulf. More likely to accommodate different contingencies, it would take 5 to 6 THAAD batteries in the Gulf to provide the protection. Now, you wouldn't just develop a missile defense architecture with only Patriots or only THAAD. What we'd use is a combination of the two for a variety of reasons. And just to be thorough, we also assessed the use of Aegis systems. The U.S. operates Aegis missile defense ships in the region. So we ran some modeling scenarios in which an Aegis stationed in Bahrain was used. The reason I picked Bahrain is because this is where the naval base is, and you could extend that to the U.S. use of the Aegis cruiser or destroyer that might be in the region. Now, as I said, let's start with the defended footprints as one measure. What we found, and it was pretty obvious, that if you share sensor data, that is the radars that are associated with the different THAAD batteries in the region, or the other radars that might be deployed, or other sensors, if you're able to share them across the different missile defense batteries, then you can greatly expand the amount of territory that can be defended by any individual battery. Well, why is this? Well, there's something called launch on remote. here, and I'll just use an example. If Iran were to launch a missile, say, from Tabriz or another missile base in northwestern Iran, where a majority of their bases are, and they intended to hit, say, Abu Dhabi or Dubai or even Qatar. If you have THAAD batteries, say, located in Saudi Arabia, one in Qatar, and two in the United Arab Emirates, there's two there because that's what their procurement plans call for right now. The first radar to see this threat as it leaves Tabriz and starts heading south is the radar in Saudi Arabia. If the Saudi radar is sharing information with the radar in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, it can develop what they call a fire control solution based on its tracking information, and you can actually launch the interceptor based in either Abu Dhabi or Dubai before the organic radar associated with those two potential launch spots actually sees the missile. This allows you to intercept at a much greater distance away from where your interceptors are located, thus the amount of territory you protect is greater. There are other ways of expanding the reach, and there are other operational scenarios, and they're described in the dossier. I won't get into them now. But I wanted to talk interceptor efficiency. Now, the interceptors that are associated with Patriot and THAAD, Aegis, they're all designed such that there's about an 80% chance that a single interceptor sent after a single missile, incoming missile, it has about an 80% chance of succeeding. Well, of course, designing something to do something and actually achieving it are two different things. But if you look at the test data during development and improvement cycles, it's above 80%, it's like 84, 85%. And if you look at the actual performance, whether it be in 2003 against Saddam's missiles or in the example in Saudi Arabia where the Yemenis have attacked Saudi territory with Scud missiles and a few other types, the success rate has been such, it matches this 80% probability of one interceptor going after one missile. That seems pretty good. It means you have an 80% chance of succeeding. Well, if your requirements call for a higher level of protection, you can launch 2 interceptors at each incoming missile. And assuming that the failure modes are independent, which they most likely would be, if you combine those two, you get about a 96% probability of successfully intercepting. Now, if you have more and more missiles coming in, say you have an attack size of 10 missiles or warheads, if you use a single interceptor, then the probability of destroying all 10 attacking missiles is about 10%. If you launch 2 interceptors at each, the probability of intercepting all of them or destroying all of the inbound missiles is about 60%. So you can see, you can start playing with the number of interceptors you commit at each inbound threat. Now, this is where layering your defenses becomes really important. You can't just start firing a barrage of 3, 4, and 5 interceptors after each incoming threat because you saturate the radars that are actually controlling or tracking the attacking missiles and controlling your interceptors. So there's a limit to what you can do. However, if you have a layered defense, say you use the THAAD battery, which does its intercepts above the atmosphere to kind of create a top layer, and then you have a Patriot battery which intercepts missiles within the atmosphere as your lower level. Here now you can conceivably use 4 interceptors, 2 at each layer, to achieve much higher levels of defense. If you were to integrate your layered system such that you get enough warning time, or there's enough time between when the first intercept might occur and when the second intercept might occur, you can do something that's called shoot, assess, shoot. That is, your top layer fires off 1 or 2 interceptors. If it is unsuccessful, then you commit your lower level defenses. This way you can actually save assets in a very effective way. Here again, when you share sensor data, you can actually implement, or you can intercept at a much greater distance, which gives you that time or window that allows you to employ the shoot, assess, shoot strategy. So what is the bottom line? Looking at these different variables, it becomes very obvious that the higher the level of integration, the better you do. You also have levels of integration where you are sharing command posts, where you actually have coordinated fire. And that is the system that has the best geometry for intercept, for example, is used rather than the one that's actually assigned to the area being attacked. These are all technical details. We describe them in the dossier. So I won't go into them here. What I want to do is conclude with what our policy recommendation is in terms of achieving kind of a gradual level of integration. One might start with a shared logistics capability. That is, the GCC itself would buy the spares, the additional stocks that might be needed, people that can actually conduct repairs of the systems as an entity, and therefore reduce the cost of what each country would have to spend. This is something that would be relatively straightforward and feasible. It would benefit everyone. It would simply require the GCC to establish a procurement or acquisition arm, and it would probably be populated by procurement officers from the different countries involved. Second level would be to integrate your early warning systems so that you can queue your radars, your fire control radars, and by queuing you can expand slightly the defended space. Presently, the United States is working together with the GCC states to create a shared early warning system. This is something that came out of the first Camp David talks a couple years ago. My understanding is that success has been, the workshops that they've been conducting have gone on fairly successfully, and an architecture has been proposed by the US. It's under consideration by the GCC states now. A third step would be an advanced network of sensors capable of tracking threats and developing fire control solution. That is integrating the fire control radars of each of the deployed missile defense systems in the region to create a common operating picture or threat environment. This can be done organically, that is, all of the missile defense systems across the Gulf, including the US systems that are deployed, or it could be done bilaterally. Each state would do it bilaterally with the United States. Obviously, the organic method gives better results, but the bilateral might be easier to implement. This is something that will have to be decided by the Gulf decision makers here in the Gulf. The next level would be to have joint training exercises across the Gulf, developing rules of engagement, establishing doctrines for how you will actually implement and use concepts of operations that are shared across the Gulf. And then this type of coordination or cooperation would allow you to employ strategies. There's something called engage on remote and other strategies that further enhance your defensive effectiveness. And then finally, there would be coordinated fire. This would be the top layer of defense. This is, to boil it down, is having a central command and control post or battle management center. Where it's located is somewhat irrelevant, but each of the defense batteries distributed across the Gulf and in the Gulf waters would be managed by a single center operated by jointly by members of each state. There are a number of sovereignty issues involved here, but most of those can be mitigated because the flight times of attacking missiles are very short, and you essentially have to have developed the software and the rules of engagement, concepts of operation in the software, and you just be giving go-aheads. So the impact on sovereignty would be minimized because everyone kind of have pre-authorized the use of interceptors or defenses in a certain way. So I'll turn it over to Toby.
Oh, let's go to questions, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Mike. Thanks, Toby. There's even more detail actually in the dossier itself, which is available, I think, from now on, at a very reasonable price. And we will have a set of further launches as well elsewhere in the Gulf, and we'll be having a major presentation on this at the Manama Dialogue. We have about 40 minutes for questions, so I'll take sets of questions, maybe 3 at a time. As chairman, I have the right to ask the first one, if I may, which is a question, I suppose, in 3 parts. One is, what do we know and what can we deduce about Iranian missile force doctrine at the moment? What role in this doctrine does the supply by Iran of missiles to proxy actors, such as Hezbollah, whom the Israelis, of course, believe have between 100 and 140,000 short and medium-range missiles play, and indeed the Houthis, for whom there have been recent reports that they have received missiles. I don't know how true this is, but the recent attack on the Emirati utility ship resembled very much the Hezbollah attack on the Hanit in 2006. And third, what role in all of this does Iranian acquisition, and indeed the acquisition by Iranian partners such as the Assad regime in Syria, of air defense systems, so area and access denial systems play? I mean, spreading it out beyond just the Gulf and looking at the wider picture. I mean, this is a question, I think, for both of you.
Well, let me start with, this is something I've been examining in more detail on a separate project, and that is, how is Iran likely to use its missiles? Now, I wish I could say I've come up with some very definitive answers, but there's enough opaqueness with regard to Iranian thoughts that it makes it more difficult. What I have seen is Iran's desire, as I mentioned earlier, to develop more and more accurate missiles. Now, there's one reason they do it is to enhance military effectiveness. Another reason is if you know where a missile's likely to land or strike, if you've aimed at a certain point, then the probability of collateral damage becomes much lower when you have more accurate systems. In my view, Iran is trying to complicate defense planning for the United States and the Gulf Arabs by attacking airfields and other military targets. I don't think they're really interested in going after cities for a variety of reasons. And almost every specialist I've talked to that's studied Iranian doctrine and behavior, I mean, there is a certain morality to the way Iran thinks about war. And attacking cities and civilians would certainly go against that. Having said that, if you look at the types of systems that Iran is supplying to Hezbollah, yes, that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, why there is that distinction, I don't know, or does that tell us that maybe some of the assumptions we have about Iranian doctrine is wrong? But I would definitely say that supplying ballistic missiles to Hezbollah and other actors, or artillery rockets, I think is more apt. It's an excellent laboratory for Iran to study the effects, to see what is effective and what is not effective. With regard to Yemen, the Yemenis actually imported about 300 Scud missiles long ago. In fact, they were actually caught importing missiles in, I think it was 2002 with the Sosan, which was intercepted by Spanish forces. These missiles were coming not from Iran, but from North Korea. So I don't think the missiles that are currently being used, the ballistic missiles currently being used by the Houthis or those aligned with Salah are actually derived from the Iranians.
Maybe shorter ship, I was really thinking.
Yeah, the anti-ship missiles, that's another story, but there's enough ambiguity about how that attack was done. We don't know whether it was the Iranians, but there is substantial evidence that Iran is providing some systems. With regard to S-300, the Iranians are in the process of procuring. I mean, this is a defensive system, much like missile defense. It's capable of air defense, it's capable of missile defense. It's a very effective system, and it will greatly complicate Gulf Arab and U.S. plans of any air attacks in Iran. So.
Okay, thanks. Toby, do you want to?
Just briefly, and if you look at the Mosaic doctrine, the use of proxies is absolutely central, as we see over many decades with Hezbollah. Pushes out, gives them defensive depth, gives them the ability to retaliate. One wonders, and Mike's exactly right, with the contradictory evidence in Yemen, depending on how and if the Houthi regime solidifies and the extent to which Iran will try a similar thing beyond laboratory to proxies there. I think it's simply too early to tell, and the territory is too contested.
Okay, okay. Thanks very much. I think I had one question from Yusuf. One question here, Yusuf. Can you identify yourselves
yes.
when you
Dr. Yusuf Mashal, political and economic works in politics and economics analysis in a research tank here in Bahrain. You're talking about missiles, you're talking about counterattacks. But was there any idea or was there any discussions on an iron curtain for the Gulf?
Pardon?
On a what?
Iron curtain.
Oh, Iron Dome. Iron Dome.
An iron dome, an iron curtain.
Iron Dome, yes.
Or maybe the Gulf is discussing with Russia on the iron ice that they called it differently, which is the ice dome. Was there any discussions on something like this to protect the whole Gulf instead of each country separately on that? Or was, I mean, in your perception, would it be a better idea to look at than to just look for counterattacks on missiles? Whether from Iran or anybody else.
Okay, thank you very much. A question here, and then a question at the back, and then I'll take more questions from over here. So we'll take 3 to start with.
Thank you very much for
This is
presentation. I wonder why the 5 power +1, they address the nuclear issue and they didn't connect it with the intercontinental ballistic missile at the time. It should have been addressed at the same time. We wouldn't be talking about it here tonight, actually.
Okay. Okay, and one question at the back, right at the back, and then we'll take questions from over there.
Abdullah Al-Hami, journalist at Al-Ayyam newspaper. If you allow me to ask in Arabic.
Have you got translation?
No.
Somebody will need to translate. Yusuf, can you? Okay, thank you.
هل تعتقدون أن جزء من تقوية الدفاعات الخليجية هو إنهاء الحرب في اليمن بشكل عاجل؟
Do you think that part of fortifying the Gulf defenses can be the ending of the war in Yemen immediately?
Yeah, okay. So those 3 questions. Let's take those 3 questions and we'll come to the others. Mike?
Well, why don't I try to take on the first 2, and if you want to add something, Toby, I'm not quite sure about the 3rd one, so I'll defer that to you. On the first question, Yosef, are you talking about Iron Dome, the system that the Israelis have developed and used? Okay. Iron Dome it operates much in the same way that Patriot or THAAD or any other missile defense system operates. But what it's designed to do is to intercept mortars and very short-range rockets. Something, yes, low altitude. And it uses, small, rather inexpensive interceptors. But it can't handle projectiles that have traveled more than 20, 40 kilometers. I'm not sure of the exact limitations of the system. So, yeah, for protecting against mortar rockets and very short range artillery rockets, it's a very effective system. But to apply it to the Gulf, you would have to have many hundreds of them, but it probably lacks the capacity, in fact I know it lacks the capacity to intercept anything that can travel from Iran to the eastern shores here. Those attacking missiles would be going far too fast and are far too large.
But what you were talking about was a much better way of doing it, was a more integrated.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, Israel is actually in the process of creating a three-layered system. One, at the lowest level you have Iron Dome. The next level is David's Sling, which is somewhat comparable to Patriot. And then they have the Arrow, which is, its performance envelope falls somewhere between Patriot and THAAD. It's, you know, they've done a lot of work on that. I think they're in the 4th generation version of it. That would be designed to protect against missiles coming from Iran. David's Sling missiles, ballistic missiles coming from, say, Syria, to pick an example. Iron Dome, mortars and short-range rockets coming from Hezbollah, Hamas, or some other non-state groups. But the integration greatly enhances the capacity of all three layers.
Yeah. JCPOA?
Oh, yes. JCPOA. This is a question that comes up in the U.S. quite a bit. Why weren't ballistic missiles included in the discussions? Quite frankly, because they wanted to get results on the nuclear issue, which to them was the paramount issue. Ballistic missiles that are not armed with nuclear weapons, there's a limit to what you can do with them. You put a nuclear warhead on it, it becomes an incredibly powerful weapon of war or destruction.
Which is more dangerous?
Which is more...
The delivery system is more dangerous.
Well, the delivery system is exactly that. It delivers the actual warhead that does the destruction.
That's what North Korea is doing, you know, bringing the two together at the same time.
Well, yes, indeed. But we're talking about Iran for the moment.
Same threat.
Yeah. So because of the importance missiles have in Iran's conventional military doctrine, it was highly unlikely that they would give in on an issue. So why complicate the discussions and negotiations on the real problem, and that was nuclear weapons.
And there are sanctions on the development of ballistic missiles with a nuclear payload, capacity, which is a weight capacity. It's a payload capacity.
Yeah, and for the foreseeable future, you know, Iran's missile capabilities, as long as they're just conventionally armed, there's a limitation to it, even if they become much more accurate. Okay. So,
just a couple of things. To be very explicit and to give the GCC its benefit, the High Military Command of the GCC's General Secretariat is explicitly committed to a GCC-wide collective missile defense program, and they would argue vociferously and at great length that they've made progress on that and that they're past the planning stage, that they have the doctrines in place. What the dossier concludes by saying is that the nearest comparator that we could find is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's own ballistic missile defense, which took over a decade to negotiate, and the vast majority of those negotiations were at the highest possible decision-making level, and it was about a protected asset list and the doctrine that would deliver an agreed set of procedures to use it. And there is not a great deal of evidence that the GCC has moved towards that, and it took NATO over a decade to do that. So I think the planning and the doctrine may well be in place, the equipment is being bought, but I think the larger debate about crucial issues hasn't been pursued. Just to echo what Mike said, the Obama administration in its negotiations with Iran clearly identified the nuclear issue as the single thing they felt they could make progress on, and cut it away not only from missiles but also Iranian policies of proxies or or everything else, and they focused on that. Now, once the deal was done, there was some optimism that a more stable, productive relationship could be negotiated with Iran on the basis of that. I frankly see no evidence that that optimism was justified. And coming to Yemen, it's a clever question because in my reading of it, it's double-edged. I'd put it the other way around, that clearly that 1,000-kilometer border or whatever it is between Yemen and Saudi won't be secured until the Yemeni, whatever the Yemeni government is, and the Saudi government have negotiated some form of mutual non-aggression pact. And that let alone the peace deal that would precede that seems to be a long way away. So yes, I think you could say that without a stable negotiated relationship between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, that border is going to be very, very difficult to seal, let alone move on to something that would give agreement on a non-aggression pact and non-use of missiles across that border.
Okay, thank you very much. There were other questions, I think. The gentleman here.
Abdullah Manai, columnist in Akhbar al-Khalij. Given that this is a talk or a dossier launch with regards to missile defense cooperation in the Gulf, I would personally like to see a local subject matter expert, at least one, to be present on the panel. But I'll just move on to my question. Michael, you discussed the swarming tactic and strategy that Iran was utilizing or was thinking about utilizing, or their strategies using swarming tactics. And as we know from the Millennium Games in 2002 between Van Ripper and Admiral Mayer, and the subsequent statements in 2008 by Admiral Mullen with regards to the correctness of the inferring that the swarm tactics were actually being used following the incident in 2008. I feel, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, that we are still looking at the tactics and strategies with regards to missile defense in terms of a very traditional point of view. We're still talking about utilizing Patriots, utilizing other defense systems. Have we looked at the possibility of utilizing cruise missiles, which are on the smaller vessels utilized by Iran in the Gulf? Have we looked at the possibility of cruise missiles being launched from Iranian submersibles or submarines in Caspian Sea? Obviously, utilizing them in the Gulf region, which is a lot shallower, would be detrimental. However, the Caspian Sea, they have an area as big as Switzerland, which is under their control. So also, Iran's tactic usually sees or views the GCC as a front, as opposed to it using its own land as a front. And so have we looked at the possibility of missiles, short-range missiles, being launched from within the GCC, from within GCC countries to target specific installations within the GCC, from what intelligence reports would call sleeper cells, or the possibility of arming sleeper cells very quickly, as we've seen in Yemen?
Okay, I think the gentleman at the back, and then we'll at the front.
Ali Al-Khatib, I'm a IISS member. My question is to Professor Dodge. You highlighted that there's a commitment from the High Command, the GCC Joint Defense Command.
Is the microphone working properly?
No. Sorry, is that work? Is that okay?
Better,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. My question is to Professor Dodge. You highlighted a commitment from the High Command of the Joint GCC Defense. So my question focuses on the intra-GCC defense relations. What's your assessment of the collaborative capacity of GCC defense policymakers when it comes to implementing such a policy, and what challenges or main obstacles do you foresee? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. And the ambassador. Yeah. I don't mind. The protocol,
You see,
My question, what do you call it, refer to the nature of GCC, cooperation. Because as far as I know, GCC was not designed to become a military pact. And I think collective security and also defense issue, as far as I know, were not mentioned in the creation of GCC charter. And however, as far as I know, joint defense project have been initiated, and the most prominent example was the formation of the PSF, the Peninsula Shield Force, I think during 1980s at the time. Yeah. And however, the PSF role is likely only symbolic. And I think the inability to detect the 1990s Iraq invasion in Kuwait, and also the minimal role in the PSF play within the international coalition that liberated Kuwait. That is one of the evidence. So when we talk about the objective of the missile defense cooperation in the region is hopefully will be enabling this region allies to defend themselves against Iranian missile threat. So my question then is, is there any possibility in terms of the capability of this region that can defend themselves?
Okay. So there's two issues about capabilities actually, which are slightly different issues. I don't know, Toby, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll start. I think the technical question I'll defer to Mike. And I very much wanted to mention the High Military Committee and its role, because we had a series of discussions with senior members of it who were adamant and clear that they'd made great progress in the technical planning and the doctrine in the negotiations they'd had. And if you look at the conclusion of this dossier, we said, well, as I just said, if there is that commitment and there is that movement, let's compare it to the other extended example of pooling sovereignty in military defense or missile defense, NATO. And then we put senior experts involved in the NATO process with senior GCC individuals. And then the debate was fascinating because the NATO experts stressed in great depth and detail and passion, they were clearly committed to this argument, that it wasn't primarily a technocratical strategic process. That in NATO, in this great decade-long torturous negotiations, it was all had to be done at the senior decision-making level, and it had to be done around incredibly difficult issues. If you have an asset protection list, for example, that you need to agree, then the decision makers at the head of the GCC states are going to be trading different assets. If you then have a doctrine of when you use it, they're going to have to agree to cede their sovereignty to a set of agreed trigger parameters, because obviously from a missile launch to it being shot down, it's far too short a period of time. It all has to be automatic. Now, the question is, both questions I suspect, is can this be done? Can we move through a framework that actually delivers meaningful political negotiation? And the hypothesis that we're working with is that this was, I know you quite rightly said that the GCC on formation wasn't a military pact and this wasn't mentioned. But of course, as I said, 18 months later, the military aspect had been set up and great progress had been made, which leads me to think that diplomatically it wasn't stressed as a military pact for obvious reasons, but it quickly became one, but then that progress slowed down. The argument would be, with a clear and growing threat in a region of heightened security worries comparable to post-79, and with, as has been delineated, the obvious benefits from a collective military defense. So you have the threat, you have the vehicle towards military defense. Can those senior leaders see the potential to negotiate around these political sovereign issues? I don't know, I have my doubts, but when you speak to the senior technocratic military planners, they are absolutely certain they can. It's just a matter of time.
Fine. I think that's also a question we'll address when we have GCC representatives, perhaps at the Manama Dialogue. Like, the last time I looked at you in the Caspian Sea, the Iranians had one old submarine in the Caspian Sea, didn't they?
Well, what happened in the Caspian Sea was there were reports that Iran launched a missile off of a boat, a container ship or something of that nature. I've tried to track down exactly what happened, but the reporting conflicts in many places, so I don't even know if it actually happened, but it's not that difficult to do it if you're launching it above, if the seas are calm and all that. Now, whether you can achieve any measure of accuracy, that's another story. And so, but let me just get back to your part of your question and expand on what Toby said. There are examples of cooperative military military cooperation in the region. That is in the maritime domain. You have the combined maritime forces that address everything from piracy to narcotics trade to the securing the trade routes, both in the Gulf and outside the Gulf. One of the reasons this has been highly successful is there are very few sovereignty issues involved, because you're doing everything out at sea. It doesn't involve the territories of any specific state. So the hurdles that one has to clear to implement cooperation in the water, in the sea, is much less than it is for, say, a joint army or a truly effective peninsula shield force. With missile defense cooperation, it's important to realize that all the sensors that you have are pointed outside. They're not directed towards any of the member states. They're all pointed towards Iran or wherever they think an offensive missile might be launched. There's some thought we need to be able to look into Syria or into Iraq, which might at some point acquire missiles and want to use them against the GCC. So that reduces some of the sovereignty issues, but you also have the issue of, well, will, for example, Qatar use its interceptors to defend Bahrain? There are some sovereign issues. Some defense planners say, I need to be able to protect myself. I'm not going to rely on anyone else. Well, in cooperating on missile defense, you're not relying on someone else. You're allowing someone else to expand the capabilities you have. So these are issues that have to be wrestled with. And I think that there will be some success at some of the lower levels of cooperation that we outlined in the recommendations. To get to your question about swarming and other traditional BMD, there was a lot of sub-questions in there. I guess what I'd like to say is, right now, all the systems that are available rely on what they call hit-to-kill, that is, interceptors running into the attacking missiles. That will probably be true for the foreseeable future, but there are programs looking at interceptors on drones that could be deployed into territory and actually destroy missiles while they're being boosted. Whether that is truly feasible will depend on the scenarios, but you know, if you're flying into another country's territory, that's an act of war. They have air defenses, et cetera, so it complicates some of the things you might want to do. The use of lasers and rail guns and other alternatives to actually missile-based interceptors are being rapidly explored. There's limitations there. There's some physics that kind of limit what you can do with lasers, at least if they're in the atmosphere, et cetera. But there are technologies being explored by Missile Defense Agency in the US and researchers that will probably change what they call the cost curve of defenses. Cruise missiles and sea-launched or submarine-launched missiles, yes, this is a concern. We're seeing this in North Korea now. They're developing this capability. There are reasons that North Korea wants to do this. Conceivably, the Iranians could do it. I think it would be a very poor investment on their part. Doesn't mean they won't do it. One has to remember that the anti-submarine warfare capabilities of the United States and Great Britain is pretty substantial. These are holdovers from the Cold War. If I were North Korea, I wouldn't bet on any of my subs lasting the first 5 minutes of war. I think they're history and will be sunk pretty quickly. What I would be worried about is Iran deploying some of these shorter range missiles like the Fatah 110 on some of the islands in the Gulf. That, I think, is something that could be handled in the diplomatic realm, is make it very clear that this would not be tolerated. Now, you have to be prepared to back that up, but that might be something very worthwhile in examining, studying, and looking to actually employ.
Great, thank you very much. I think we'll go room for space for one more round of very quick questions. I have one, I have a repeat question, and I have one at the back. So there's four. Okay, four. Sir.
I have three short questions. One, how much will the missile defense system will cost totally for the GCC countries? And my second question, would this missile defense, air defense, will protect should Iranians send speedboats in hundreds from the sea? And my third, have IISS made any research to find out what is a problem between Iran and the GCC countries that cannot be resolved peacefully and avoid all these expenses and all the threat?
Okay, someone pays us for that. That's the next 10 years of research. I think we'll go to Ambassador, then we'll go to the back.
Thank you very much for the nice explanation. My name is Asako, Japanese ambassador in Bahrain. The basic question that there's improvement of the credibility of the missile launch in the Iranian side. And also there's a heavy retaliation in case they trigger the launching from the other side. So how do you see the situation which put the trigger for Iranian side to launch the missile to GCC countries?
Good question. Thank you. So your second question, short?
Yeah. Quick one. Each battery unit consists of 4 missiles, and 55 of them is 220. General Soleimani said, if there is a threat to Iran, we'll fire 11,000 missiles in 1 minute. Yeah. And I said, what will happen in the second minute? And the second question I'm raising is about the early warning system, which basically only the United States and Russia and France and other European countries, is the monitoring of communications of the military frequency and the infrared signature of the missile ignition and the liftoff. This information has to be shared with the ground commander here to take a decision, because you only have 10 to 15 minutes warning from the start. Thank you.
The communication at the back, the gentleman with the headphones. Somehow.
وليد اخبار الخليج نيوز بيبر الاسكن ان عربيك. اوكي. تحدثتم في البدايه عن ان قاعده الصواريخ الايرانيه بتهدد أيضا إسرائيل. برغم من ذلك لم نرى اعتراض قوي من إسرائيل على الاتفاق النووي. وأيضا نريد أن نعرف ما هو الذي تمتلكه إسرائيل لكي تأمن من قاعدة الصواريخ الإيرانية. شكرا.
We haven't heard you address Israel's concern regarding the missile stockpile of Iran. And we did not see any objection to the Iranian nuclear deal by Israel. So what do you have to say about that?
Mike, do you want to?
Sure. What does Israel have to protect itself?
Okay. There's quite a lot of technical stuff there. Mike, do you want to talk about?
Sure. How much do these systems cost? The glib answer is a lot. I think the buying in cost is. I mean, I actually don't know what a Patriot system costs off the top of my head, or a THAAD system. I know that each interceptor for Patriot costs on the order of $1 million. Each interceptor for THAAD is on the order of $10 million. So you're sending a $10 million interceptor after, I mean, a Scud costs what, $300,000, $1 million? It's not, they're not expensive. So I think the real big cost, and this is something the United States is struggling with as they deploy more and more Patriot batteries around the world, is Patriot battery to operate 24/7 all the time, you know, requires about 155, 160 people. And then these people have to be rotated. Yeah, so, I mean, you're talking, it's a great cost in terms of personnel. Now, if, say, you're Qatar, they're seeking to buy 11 Patriot batteries. You know, you're talking almost 2,000 people. You know, do they even have the resources, you know, not financial, but the personnel resources to actually field these systems and operate them? That's a big question, and I think this is something, as I said, that the U.S. military is. Protection against speedboats. This is a question better answered by Navy people, but if the worry is that the speedboats will have rockets that they can launch, yeah, no, that presents a different set of problems. Missile defense won't address them, but other types of defense would. 11,000 missiles that Iran claims to have. In terms of what, yeah, that could actually cross the Gulf, you know, have a range of 300 or more kilometers, the number is probably closer to 500, maybe 600. It is not 11,000. I mean, they're talking about the very short-range artillery rockets. With regard to Israel, well, one, Israel was not very happy with the nuclear deal. If you listen to their prime minister, who berated the U.S. president quite often about it. But Israel does have a lot of protection against a ballistic missile coming from Iran. As I said earlier, they have 3 layers of defense. Arrow is specifically designed to address the threat from Iran. Plus there will be Aegis ships operated by the U.S. in the Eastern Mediterranean that could provide defense against missiles coming from Iran headed towards Israel or any NATO country for that matter. I think those are the questions. Oh, triggering? Well, that's, I'm going to leave that. That one's a hard question. Yeah, I'm going to leave that for Toby. Yeah. Yeah, quickly, what could trigger missile attacks? I think that once Iran uses its missiles, they lose their luster and lore and their deterrence capacity, because I don't think they will be, that we can defend against them and that the damage they can inflict is quite small. What would trigger it is, I think, an attack against their nuclear infrastructure, some kind of physical attack. They will not be the first to fire a missile across the Gulf.
And yes, very briefly, I mean, the simple, if glib answer is a mutual commitment on what we'd call in academia a Westphalian peace, which basically means that all the littoral states around the Gulf agree not to pick up and interfere across state boundaries, and that would go a very long way to building reassurance, to recognizing, to downscaling the Mosaic asymmetrical missiles that worry so much, but also the proxy warfare that we've talked about, and the great fears on this side of a Gulf of an asymmetrical and covert attack unfolding. So that would be the small thing. That would be the big thing. How you walk towards that, I suspect, is a statement of non-aggression on all sides, and I think a statement that the ambitions of all states stop at their own territorial extent. And married to that would be a commitment to move away from the ability to covertly and overtly to project power beyond your territorial. So all of that would be facilitated by a regional security dialogue that happens to be happening here in Manama on the 9th of December.
Which is a fantastic way to end. I should just add, since I did start the question, that the treaties of Osnabrück and Munster, which made up the Peace of Westphalia, actually did envisage limited interference by neighbouring sovereigns in the affairs of other sovereign states. But it was a system of mutual security which depended upon a degree of confidence that took a long time to achieve.
Intriguingly, the main opponent to the Treaty of Westphalia was the Vatican, because it was a direct attack
on the rights of
its
Catholic
ability
princes
to project transnational religious observance. So maybe that's where we should be working.
Yes. That's for the next time. No,
There's just one question outside of all this. Just one small thing.
20 seconds.
One. Question from the streets, from the people who don't talk about politics or anything. That always comes out, why? What is the benefit of the US doing all this? Let Iran bomb us.
20 seconds.
We don't care.
20 seconds.
Is it economical? Is it security? What is it?
Yusuf, 20 seconds. I'm not sure we have time to answer that, but I think...
20 seconds. The US is clearly, although it waxes and wanes, the hegemonic power, the dominant power in the region. Iran wants that to disappear, and to challenge that, that immediately puts their interests in mutual tension. And the United States has been the major security guarantor in the Gulf for as long as I've been coming here. And look at the absolute fear it engenders when those guarantees look to be waning. So I think clearly America has major interests in the Gulf, but the Gulf states also have major interests in keeping America here.
Great. Thank you all very, very much. As I said, the next one of these sessions that we're going to have is next week on the 3rd of November with a distinguished Japanese expert. So do come to that. And thank you all very much. And thank you as well to Mike and to Toby. Thank you. The Vatican was concerned because of the alienation of Catholic lands within the possibility of alienation of Catholic lands within Protestant. You're very welcome. And of course, the 30 Years' War only ended with a treaty.